Moving on to the very good tier, and honestly there isn't that much to explain about this one. Very good is where I think the truly amazing fights start. All of them will have flaws, but manages to be very enjoyable despite them. From here on out, I'll consider every fight to be among the best in any game. It's just that FromSoft's average is so high that there's still 2 more tiers after this one. So let's kick off the very good tier with
Someone must extinguish thy flame. Let it be Margit the Fell.
Margit is what I consider to be the best first boss FromSoft has ever made. Many people probably disagree with me and not even count him as the first boss, as technically you can, and probably will, fight several bosses before him. Personally, I do consider him to be the first boss, as he's the first proper boss that a majority of players will fight, as the game immediately pressures you to head to Stonevale Castle after leaving the catacombs. I do think that you are technically meant to go to the Weeping Peninsula first, as the enemies there are easier and there isn't much point to go there after the castle. That out of the way, let's get to the fight itself. The main reason I consider Morgott to be the best first fight is that he does the best job of preparing you for what the rest of the game is going to be like. His moveset reflects how most other enemies are going to fight, being a mix between melee and ranged, and fast and slow. He also has several combos that have unique timing, but this will mean he will often break the pace of the fight to charge an attack. In previous Souls game, most of the fights followed a certain rhythm, making it so that even if you hadn't seen an attack before, you could very reliably guess roughly about when the attack would happen. Margit breaks this tradition by having several attacks in which the charge up will linger for what feels like an uncomfortable amount of time. This tends to catch a lot of veteran players off guard, forcing them to pay more attention to the specific moves and having to learn them individually, instead of just learning the general rhythm. I also find this to be an interesting mechanic regardless of being new or a returning player, as the time during which the attack is being charged creates this weird tension in you, making you almost want to yell at him to just swing already. It's almost akin to walking down a dimly lit corridor in a horror game where you just know there's going to be a jump scare, making you tense up in anticipation the entire way through. This sort of attack will also be used later on in the game, so giving it to Margit is a great way of letting both old and new players know about this shift in design. Margit also has a phase change in the middle of his fight without there being a break. Personally, I love it when FromSoft does this. It keeps the flow of the fight while still mixing it up by giving bosses some more moves. Margit does this very well, getting some new moves while also keeping his old so you don't get overwhelmed. This might be a bit more controversial, but I like Margit's mechanic where he will input read and do a ranged attack if you drink. This punishes the player if they try to drink when the boss is ready to react. I think most people have a strong reaction to this because they're used to bosses just letting them do whatever they want in previous Souls games. This change makes it so you actually have to create a situation yourself where you can heal, something that is way more rewarding and makes much more sense. I do think he does have some problems though. Since I've played every modern Souls game before, I personally don't find him that hard, but I do think he's a bit too hard for casual players, and even some experienced ones. This might have been done to teach you that if a boss is too hard, then you should explore the open world and become stronger first, but if this is the case, I think they could have done a much better job at conveying this to the player. The first thing that is told you after you escape the tomb is that you should head to the castle by both Vare and Melina. Even after you die to Margit, there isn't anything that tells you, or even as much as implies, that maybe you should go and explore outside more. This is partly why I find it so confusing that they send you to Stormvale Castle right away, when they could point you towards the Weeping Peninsula instead. He does also have some attacks that I don't like, mostly his dagger attacks. It feels a bit arbitrary when in combos he decides to pull it out, making it hard to play around. But it doesn't do all that much damage, so it doesn't end up affecting the fight all that much. So overall, I think Margit is a fantastic boss. He does an amazing job at teaching both new and veteran players what to expect for the rest of the game. I think he gets a lot of flack from certain players because he's the first boss to implement several new mechanics. I probably would have put him in a higher position if it weren't for the fact that he has another fight later on. Out of all the fights in this series, this is the one that feels the most like an actual duel. It's honestly hard to explain why Sir Alonne's fight is as good as it is if you haven't tried it yourself. Best way I can explain it, as I have with several other fights, is that the fight just has a really good flow to it. You aren't really thinking about too many other things, just looking at your opponent and reacting. None of his attacks are bullshit, there's no extra unique mechanic, it's just a duel between you and a boss with a moveset that is genuinely fun to play against. This being said, he does have some flaws. The biggest one is his godforsaken runback. Getting to the boss is one of the worst experiences I had in Dark Souls 2. Not only is it long, it has about 1,000,000 enemies lined up between you and the boss, several of which being ranged. It's honestly rare that you manage to make it to the boss without taking any damage at all. You should have just been put right in front of the boss as you go into the enemy. It's actually beyond me why they didn't do this. The second thing has nothing to do with the fight really, and it's just a Dark Souls 2 problem in general, and that is that you'll get clipped a lot. Even if you manage to dodge attacks perfectly, he'll still chip away at your HP. This doesn't really matter that much, as the fight isn't hard enough to where the chip damage really matters. Where it does matter is when he does it with his grab. Instead of doing chip damage, he'll just straight up grab you. And like this isn't bad enough, his grab attack also has an extra mechanic where it powers him out. So if you're unlucky, the game can really fuck you over. Sir Alonne is one of the few fights in Dark Souls 2 that I genuinely enjoyed. Thank God for the DLCs. This is where we pass the threshold into bosses that I think are actually quite difficult. Dancer is a very unique boss, because even though she technically is a humanoid with swords, she has probably one of the most unique movesets in the entire franchise. Most of her moves are slow yet graceful, very befitting of her name. She doesn't have any attacks that I consider bad. I think it's the opposite. I think every move she has is interesting and fun to play against. This makes for a boss that has what I've been calling so far a very good flow. There's never a dull moment as long as you engage with the boss. It's a constant dance where you're dodging and attacking. Dancer also has the added bonus of having a really interesting visual design. From her actual model to her weapons, she's one of the most interesting looking humanoid bosses that FromSoft has produced. I've even had an entire playthrough where I used her armor and weapons, though admittedly her weapons do kinda suck. The only real criticism I can muster is that your first time fighting her can be frustrating, as you teleport straight into her fight after killing the last Lord of Cinder, excluding Twin Princes of course. This will result in you dropping all your souls in her boss room, as you will most likely die to her in your first attempt. You can just simply retrieve them by picking them up and homeward boarding out of there, but that's obviously not ideal. Contrary to most bosses this high on the list, I actually have caught a lot of problems with Pontiff, yet still, I do think he is a great boss. So let me first explain the problems I have with him, and then I'll get into why I still think he's fantastic. One of the most obvious problems is with his attacks themselves. Pontiff has a very varied moveset, with a pretty even split between fast and slow attacks, though most of my problems do come from his fast ones. As I mentioned with some other bosses on the list, some of Pontiff's attacks are simply way too fast. To save myself the trouble of having to measure it myself, I'm just going to use Joseph Anderson's video as my proof. I'm not going to just rip a section of his video, so I highly encourage you to click the timestamp link in the description to get a more fleshed out explanation of this topic. But to summarize the parts that are relevant to my point, some of Pontiff's attacks are unreasonably fast. Anderson measures that the average needed frames for a person to be able to react to an attack is around 15. Pontiff has at least 2 attacks whose windups are faster than 15 frames, these being this stab attack and this overhead slash. To further compound these issues, both of these attacks share their windup animation with other moves that are much slower, creating a problem where you have to dodge immediately, assuming that he's going to use his fast attack. If he does not use this attack, but the slower version, you will now be guaranteed to get hit. This is a pretty big problem when the entire Souls franchise is built on being hard but fair. The next point is a bit more of a subjective one, but since it's my list video, I think it's appropriate for me to include it anyways. When you get Pontiff to about half HP, he will enter a second phase where he spawns a clone of himself. As discussed with Dark Lurker, creating a clone can be an interesting addition to a fight, but with Pontiff I don't think it quite hit the mark. While Dark Lurker's clone will interact with the main body, creating unique combos and patterns, Pontiff's clone is a lot more boring. All the clone does is the exact same move as the main body, with that slight delay. All this achieves is making the fight more frustrating, as it heavily limits or just straight up removes any openings you have to counterattack. Personally, I don't think it adds any depth to the fight, and my usual solution is just to tank through attacks right when he is spawned to rush down the clone and continue the fight as a 1v1. So those are some pretty major flaws for a fight that I rate to be very good, and to be frank, it's hard to really justify this spot. Like many bosses before it, much of it comes down to the flow of the fight. Even despite the major flaws to his moveset, Pontiff is a lot of fun to fight. His difficulty, even despite his problems, is a major factor for his placement. Even though I think Dark Souls 3 is one of, if not outright, the best game of the series, it doesn't have a whole lot of hard fights. The DLCs do rectify this to a certain extent, but I do think the base game is a bit lackluster. There's only 4 fights that I would really consider to be actually challenging, with Pontiff being the hardest out of these. Difficulty on its own obviously doesn't carry a fight, cough cough mid-ear, but Dark Souls 3 desperately needed some harder fights to bolster its arsenal, and Pontiff just so happened to be what the game needed, even despite its flaws. Martyr Logarius is a rare one. As you start the fight, he's mostly a caster. He does have his sight that he'll occasionally use to swipe at you, but for the most part he'll be using his magic attacks. To be honest, I don't think he's particularly fun to fight during this phase. Most of his magic attacks are just to create space between you and the boss, making the fight a bit tedious and slow. But once you manage to whittle him down to around 75%, the entire fight shifts. Logarius goes from this slow spellcaster to a very aggressive melee enemy. He draws his short sword and doesn't really use any more spells for the rest of the fight. Instead, he starts running you down. He's either constantly rushing at you or already in your face swiping at you with the sword. His moveset is a bit limited, but he does make up for it with his aggression. He's the type of boss that I think would only work in Bloodborne's fast-paced combat system. As far as flaws go, I honestly don't have that many, other than the start of the fight of course. Once you get him to his second phase, he's just a really enjoyable fight. One of the first proper hard bosses in the game, at least he was for me. Morgott is very much like Pontiff for me. While I do rate the fight fairly highly, I do also have a bunch of problems with it. The problems I have with these fights are very different. With Morgott, most of my problems come from just how exhausting he is to fight against. What I mean by this is that there honestly just aren't all that many openings against him. You will very often launch into combos that are 7 or even 8 attacks long, just to end them by jumping away, making it so that you either get one light attack in or just none at all. You will then proceed to rush in again and just unleash another barrage at you, rinse repeat. The norm before Elden Ring was that the bosses will often use slower individual attacks with sporadic combos every now and then. Morgott isn't like this. Almost all of his attacks are combos. This is what I mean by exhausting. You will on average roll 4 to 5 times for every one hit you get on him. This might sound a bit hypocritical as I just praised Logarius for being aggressive, but the big difference between these two fights is that one is in Elden Ring and the other one is in Bloodborne. Everything about Bloodborne's combat system is designed with speed and aggression in mind. While not slow, Elden Ring's combat is at least slower. It simply doesn't allow for the same fast-paced movement that is required for fights like this. Another problem I have with this fight is actually one that he shares with Pontiff. A lot of his attacks are simply way too similar. This ends up having the same effect as it does with Pontiff, where there simply isn't any way for you to know exactly what attack is going to come next, ending up with you taking a lot of cheap hits. In the same vein, Morgott has this unique mechanic where he would just straight up change what attack he will do in a combo. Instead of all of his combos being predetermined, it feels as though he has a pool of attacks that he will string together in a random order. This could honestly be an interesting mechanic for a fight, but I simply find Morgott to be way too fast and complex for this sort of system to be tested. Maybe if they try again in the DLC or eventual sequel with a boss that is much slower, I think they could probably make it work. Just like with Pontiff, my reasoning is basically the same. I rate Morgott highly because despite all of these faults, I do think he's a very fun fight. You also meet him around the same time as you do with Pontiff in Dark Souls 3, where you feel a pretty massive spike in difficulty as you transition into what I consider to be the late game of the respective games. I think both of these bosses are perfectly placed, something that does a lot of heavy lifting with my enjoyment of their fights. A lot of bosses, like Pontiff and Morgott, have two main ways of attacking. A main weapon that is slow yet punishing, and one smaller one that is fast but does less damage. Usually the trap that these bosses fall in is that they will make the small weapon way too fast, as we've discussed previously. While the Abyss Watchers do also use a greatsword dagger combo, where they differ is that their dagger moves are finally done right. Their attacks are never too fast, and they don't have an over-reliance on them like others tend to have. To further add to this, Abyss Watchers also do a fantastic job of comboing their weapons. Instead of just having two distinct weapons, they feel as one, where in several of the attacks they will use the dagger in some indirect way to complement their sword attacks, like in the rush attack wherein they'll use the dagger as a sort of break by stabbing it into the ground. To complement the multiple weapons, there are also multiple Abyss Watchers. While this is a mechanic that I usually don't like, I find this to be the exception to the rule. The way it works is that there are 3 Abyss Watchers in the fight. One acts as the main boss and therefore is the health bar for the fight, the second is a pure add and has their own HP pool, and the third is a wildcard. He's corrupted and can attack anyone in the arena. This third enemy is mostly why I think this fight works. Instead of having to fight well outnumbered, you have a wildcard in the mix that can both tank and do damage for you. While this could make the fight too easy, he's also able to damage you, making so you still have to play around him to some extent. You do also get some satisfaction from manipulating his AI in such a way that he does exactly what you want from him. Abyss Watcher also does my favorite thing that a multi-enemy boss fight can do. It has a second phase, which is a pure one-on-one fight between you and the boss. The way the Abyss Watchers do this is when you fully drain the first health bar, you get a short cutscene that shows you the main enemy you have been fighting powering up. You will then completely fill his health bar back up, and you have to fight him again. The difference is that now he's alone and has several new moves, and also an added fire mechanic to both his old and new moves. The fire mechanic is very obviously borrowed from another boss that they've made, though we haven't made it to our tier quite yet. The second phase fight is superb. He still has a good balance between fast and slow attacks I talked about earlier. Abyss Watchers is one of those fights where the boss just doesn't have any bad moves. All his moves are well balanced and fun to play against, making it flow really well. His difficulty is also balanced perfectly for when you fight the boss, making him challenging but not too difficult. Abyss Watchers is one of the best intermediate bosses FromSoft has ever made and very much deserves a spot on the list. Fume Knight is another one of those fights where he's in general a pretty fantastic fight, he's just being held back by a few pretty major flaws. This being said, I want you to understand that even though this segment will mostly be about his flaws, I think Fume Knight is overall a very good fight, and if it weren't for these flaws he'd probably be an entire tier above his current standing. Let's get the most obvious thing out of the way. Fume Knight is a Dark Souls 2 boss. Obviously I'm not going to just shit on the fight purely for being in Dark Souls 2, but it does come with some baggage. The biggest thing being the clipping issue. Many of Fume Knight's faster attacks will end up clipping you and doing chip damage even if you are mid-roll. This is a problem with most bosses in Dark Souls 2 and sadly Fume Knight is no exception. That being said, it fortunately isn't as big of a problem with Fume Knight as it has with some other fights. Next up, the healing aspect. To refresh your memory, as it has been a while since Dark Souls 2 released, around the arena there are several statues that emit an aura that will heal the boss if he gets close to them. Usually I'm a fan of mechanics that affect the fight from outside the arena, but this one just didn't quite hit the mark. On its own the healing isn't really a problem, it's what you have to do to get rid of them that I have taken issue with. You need to get these rods that you get from exploring the DLC. The problem is, getting all of them is pretty tedious. Some of them are hidden in places that you don't really want to explore and are really easy to miss. Luckily these statues don't have that much of an effect on the fight. Even if you do the bare minimum of exploring, you still end up with enough rods to at least clear one half of the arena. From here it's really easy to just pull the boss to that side, never really having to worry about the mechanic at all. Last point is a bit of a petty one, but it's one I want to talk about. As I mentioned previously with Velstadt, some bosses in this game have attacks in the form of balls that they will shoot out. I don't know what went wrong, as FromSoft are usually really good at hitboxes, but these balls are some of the worst hitboxes I've ever seen. I will try to get some examples on screen, but these balls will actually hit you no matter where you're standing. This is the only attack I have problem with this entire kit, but I needed to vent. And finally we get to why I would consider to be the best dragon fight in the entire series. Placidusax is not only the best dragon fight in the series, but it's somehow one of my favorites altogether. I honestly think that the number one thing that Placidusax does better than any other dragon fight is that it's actually unique. It's not like every other dragon fight where it has pretty much the exact same form, so the fight just devolves into running under it and hitting one of its back legs. Not only does it have a completely different form from other dragons, it also has a completely different moveset. This makes it so he doesn't have any of those really annoying moves that most dragons have. He instead replaces them with actual decent moves that aren't frustrating to play against. He does have a lot of moves where it requires you to run away from him, and while I have criticized some other bosses for this, I think that Placidusax more than makes up for it by having a lot of downtime where you can get plenty of hits in. This is amped up quite a bit once you get him to about half HP. Here Placidusax will start to do a lot of attacks in a row where you don't really have any opportunity to counterattack. While not great, I think it's excused in this instance as frankly it just looks cool. The way he disappears and reappears while attacking not only just looks amazing, it also does an amazing job of making you, the player, feel really cool for dodging as well. I think this is one of the biggest strengths of the fight. It looks stunning and makes you feel really cool at the same time. Guardian Ape, like a lot of other bosses on this list, doesn't really have that many flaws, but is also kind of carried by the combat system he's in. Though obviously it isn't a negative that I place to the strength of the combat system for the game he's in. Guardian Ape is just a fight that does everything above average while playing to the strength of the combat system, resulting in a fight that is at the same time very entertaining to play while still being fairly challenging. But let me get a bit more in depth about the things that I think Guardian Ape does especially well. The way his moves completely change between phase 1 and 2 is done exceptionally well. In phase 1, the ape is in control, something that results in a chaotic fight. It is a wild rampaging animal that doesn't have much rhyme or reason for what it does. It makes for an interesting fight, but alone isn't that interesting. Where the fight really picks up is during the second phase. This is where the centipede takes control. He starts fighting with a sword and is a lot more calculated in his moves. They're still very big, broad attacks, doing a great job at looking like something else is controlling the body. This change is also reflected in the gameplay. In phase 1, it's more a focus on dodging and weaving in and out, as the monkey is unpredictable and hard to counter. In phase 2, this completely changes as now it fights with a sword and is more determined in its actions, changing the focus from dodging to parrying. Another nice detail from phase 1 to 2 is that the boss stops being afraid of firecrackers. Basically every animal in the game is afraid of firecrackers, just like any normal animal would be. But as you change to phase 2 and the centipede takes control, the boss completely ignores the firecrackers, something I thought was a nice touch. The only negative that I can think of is that the arena is a bit wasted. There are several trees around the arena that you can grapple to, but the game never actually gives you any reason to do this. If anything, grappling to these trees is actively a bad idea, as it will lock you in animation which can result in you getting hit. Not sure what the idea was or if it was a scrapped idea, but it doesn't really negatively affect the fight. So yeah, to sum up, I think the main strengths of this fight come from its presentation. I honestly don't think any fight even comes close to the level of detail that you can see in the Guardian Ape, which is why I adore it so much. Obviously, the gameplay part is also well done, being a boss that is fun to play against and also quite challenging. All this culminating in what I would consider to be the second best boss in Sekiro. While I think a lot of people will agree with my placement of Ivory King, the same can't be said for my reasoning. As far as gameplay goes, I don't find the Ivory King to be a particularly good boss. I would argue that most of his strengths come from his presentation and setup. From the very start, the way the fight is set up is really good. You get to talk to the Queen, who gives you some general backstory on the King and the area, and then asks you to go to gather the Knights of Liam Lois. As I've said previously, I generally like it when bosses have mechanics outside of the fight itself. In this case, is that the game gives you a goal while you explore the area, which then later affects the final fight. The task itself is set up well, as you don't need to go out of your way to find them, like you do with the Fume Knight. You'll easily find them all by just exploring the areas you normally would. After you have gathered up your boys, it's time to start the fight. Immediately, the fight starts off strong, as the entrance to the fight is really cool. You drop down a massive hole with all your boys, as you get a good overview of the entire arena and a massive portal. The start of the fight is pretty much just an ad fight, though it's more interesting than your average ad fight, as this time there actually is a goal. You hold off the chariot knights as your own knights seal the portals by sacrificing themselves one by one. This is pretty fun and cinematic, very unlike other FromSoft fights. After you've sealed all the smaller portals, an absolute massive one opens up in front of the arena. Out of the portal walks the Ivory King, and this scene is one of the best entrances any boss has in the entire series. Though unfortunately, this is where my first problem with the fight is. After you've sealed all the portals, you still have one knight left over. Personally, I think this greatly takes away from the fight, as I would much rather it be a straight 1v1. If I wanted help, I would have just used the summon. You might counter this by saying that you don't need to pick up all the knights, but there's no way for you to know this your first time through, and there's no way to get rid of the knight once you have them picked up. Ignoring the extra knight, the second phase is pretty good, in both presentation and gameplay. Despite being another humanoid with a sword, his design is quite distinct. It does some good storytelling on its own, reaffirming many of the things you've been told or read so far. Though gameplay wise, I do find him to be a bit lacking. His moveset is overall very simple with nothing really all that noteworthy. I get the feeling that FromSoft held back in terms of difficulty because of the length of the fight. Because of all the stuff before the actual boss spawning, they might have intentionally made him a fairly forgiving boss so the player wouldn't be burnt out retrying him several times. Though this is purely speculation from my part. After having fought him for a bit and dropping his HP by around a quarter, he will then infuse his sword with some ice magic stuff. Visually, he does look pretty dope, but it comes at the cost of gameplay. See, this effect does extend the reach of his weapon, but the amount feels very arbitrary. It is not the entire length of the visual effect, but it stops at some random point. This makes it fairly hard to judge the range of his attacks. You would also think that after he has applied this, it would last for the rest of the fight, but weirdly enough, if you fight him for long enough, it just kinda drops off. I don't really get why it does this, it just makes what is already a relatively easy fight even easier, and it just feels really random. And it's not like it's some secret cheese where you just run around until it runs out. Even if you fight him seriously, it will most likely run out before you manage to kill him, as he has quite a lot of HP. I just find this so weird. Like, imagine you're fighting Fume Knight and then 2/3 into the fight his flame coating just randomly drops. So overall, I find this fight to be very much style over substance. And this might be a bit of a hot take, but I actually really like this approach to fights. I don't think that every fight needs to be this complex fight with a million different mechanics that is really hard. Sometimes all you need in a fight is just appealing visuals that make you feel really cool. I am somewhat sad there aren't really all that many other fights like the Ivory King, where the presentation took precedence, so I hope to see more in the future. Okay, to be fair, the start of this fight is lackluster. It's just you killing two ads while pulling them away from Niall. Thankfully, as long as you're on the level, you can just one-shot one of them as they spawn, making it so it isn't really all that tedious. Killing both the ads will make Niall enraged, keeping his old moves but gaining a wind and lightning effect and some new moves. To be completely honest, the main reason I like this fight so much is because how cool all of his moves look. I've always had a weak spot for characters who use likes to fight, and Niall is no exception. Adding on top of this his lightning effects, and I think he's one of the most visually striking bosses in the entire game. His moveset gameplay wise isn't really anything special. He's a slightly above average intermediate boss, not too easy but not too hard. Most people would probably beat him in like 1, 2, 3 tries. Where it really shines is how it feels to play against. He's the opposite of Morgott for me. All his attacks are big attacks that are all distinct from each other. This makes Niall feel a lot more rewarding to dodge against and makes for a much better flow in his combat, both visually and in gameplay. Yeah, I don't know, I really don't have that much to say about him. I just think he's a blast to fight, even if he isn't all that hard. Only thing really holding him back in my opinion are the ads at the start of the fight, and the fact that he isn't particularly hard. And to round out the very good tier, we have Father Gascoigne. Gascoigne is a two-phase boss. The first phase is an NPC style fight where you fight against another Fume Knight. This works out in Gascoigne's favour as fights against other hunters are the best type of fights in Bloodborne. Meanwhile, the second phase is a beast type enemy. This is a fantastic idea for several reasons. First, and most obviously, this spices up the fight by drastically changing it halfway through. But this also makes it so as an early game boss, Gascoigne prepares the player for the two most common types of fights in the game. I also think it's a fairly smart move to make his fight a decent chunk into the game, instead of right at the start, which means the developers had more of an opportunity to build up the fight and give him additional mechanics, such as interacting with his daughter and getting the music box. While we're on the topic of the music box, this is another reason why I think Gascoigne is a great fight. He actually has lore and therefore ties to the world. If you didn't know, you can actually meet Gascoigne's daughter before his fight. She'll mostly talk to you about him, giving you some backstory, and at the end she'll give you a music box. If you use this music box during Gascoigne's second phase, you'll temporarily stun him. Personally, I think this adds a lot to the fight. Instead of just being some random character you know nothing about, he actually feels like a person, and therefore feels like you actually have a reason for fighting him other than just to progress through the game. Like I said previously, his phase 1 is a fight against another hunter, most likely the first one you'll have in the game. His moveset is pretty good here, a good mix between light and heavy attacks, giving you a good opportunity to learn both dodging and parrying with your gun. All of his attacks in this phase are good, with no outliers that feel unfair or just straight up bad. Moving on to the second phase, he'll transform into a beast. This gives him a completely new moveset, making it so you have to completely change how you approach the fight. While you could take it fairly slow in phase 1 if you wanted to, this won't really work after he transforms. While in his beast form, Gascoigne is much more aggressive, like the name implies. He becomes a lot more predictable, not really caring much for defense and just rushing you down. Just like his phase 1, none of his attacks in this phase are problematic either. All are fun to play against, and none feel out of place or unfair. So as a whole, Gascoigne is pretty close to a flawless fight. The only reason why I'm not rating him higher is that he's an early game fight and therefore not having the same complexity as the bosses above him. Though there is one early fight that I would rate above him. So there you have it, my very good tier. So for the end, I'm just going to go off the cuff on this one. Usually I'll script them, but I'm just going to go top of my head. A few things, obviously, took a while to get this video out, sorry about that. I'll try and work more consistently on the future ones and just try and finish the series. Because at this point I just want to finish the entire tier list and then work on something a bit more freely. I have started on a couple of other projects, like I'm doing a backlog video for video games that I want to play. But that isn't going to be a thing until a year plus. I also recently got a new PC, so I lost all my footage for my playthroughs, which was a bit unfortunate. So that's why all the footage I've used for this video was just scrapped together from YouTube videos and such. Which is also why I didn't get footage for specific things that I wanted to show off in the video, which was unfortunate, but it is what it is. But yeah, other than that, we have 2 more videos to go before I'm done with the tier list altogether, with the great tier and the amazing tier, which is my top 10. So the great tier is 10 and then amazing, which is my actual top 10. They do take quite a bit longer towards the end. I'll have to revise the script and whatnot, but because I wrote this stuff like over a year ago, but they do get quite long towards the end, so the videos will probably be just longer and longer, and my last one will probably be quite long. And then afterwards I'll try and do like a super cut where I'll splice all of them together to make one long video, which I think will be kind of cool. But yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add, so thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever. And I'll try and not take another 10 months for the next video.